Hey all, so I just picked up this Neve clone. This is the BAE 1028. Supposedly the BAEs are supposed to be the closest to the original Neves and have the best low end. I've never used an original Neve, so I can't tell you either way on that, but the low end, that did intrigue me because I want to use this on my bass drum and really beef that up. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna go through, look at a whole bunch of the specs on this thing, look at some things that's not obvious about it, and we're gonna have a ton of sound samples to hear how it sounds on the bass drum. First up, I thought this was packed pretty well. There's not a lot of bubble wrap or anything in there, but there is a ton of space between the unit and the box, and that should help ensure that, nothing's gonna jab through it and hit the equipment. Inside the box, you'll find a power supply unit, 2 cables, and the rack unit itself. Each of these things is individually plastic wrapped as well. One thing you won't find in the box, a manual. This is one thing that drives me nuts about this high-end gear. Same thing with API. They often don't ship with a manual either. At least on API's website, when I bought the 3124V, they had a manual on the site. It was very minimal, but at least it was something. BAE, they don't have a manual either. They just have some specs that you can print out. But there's actually some really important things to know, some important quirks about this gear that would be great to have in a manual. But I've figured these things out. I'll let you know what they are as we go through each of the different features. So let's get started by talking about the power supply unit. Now, you're probably used to most rack gear you're buying having some sort of integrated power supply. That is not true for the BAE. In fact, it's actually not true for some other Neve clones either. So what happens is basically you have just the rack unit, a separate power supply. You have to run power from the wall to the power supply and then another cable to your rack unit. This particular power supply can actually run 2 rack units. Obviously, it's going to run for the one that you have right now. If you buy a second rack unit later, you don't need to buy a second power supply. That can save you a little bit of money. The first cable that you get, the IEC cable, is a standard cable you would use on a computer. You just plug that in from your wall, or more ideally from your power conditioner, into the PSU. That's a 2-meter cable, I believe they ship it with. And then there is a 5-pin power cable that runs from the power supply unit to your rack. I think that was a 6-foot cable. One important thing to note is that the power switch is on the separate dedicated PSU, not on the rack unit. That means that if you want to be able to easily turn this thing on and off, you need to either keep that power supply within arm's reach or leave it on all the time and then use your power conditioner to turn the power on and off. Now that 5-pin cable, it plugs into the back of the rack unit. Also on the back of the rack unit, you'll see 3 XLR ports. There's a mic in, a line in, and a line out. Jumping to the front left of the rack unit, you'll see a very faint blue LED that lights up whenever the rack unit actually has power. There's also a 1/4-inch input that's for your DI. Next up are 4 old style looking push buttons, and these are for selecting the DI, whether or not you want phantom power, whether or not you want to invert the phase, and turning on and off the EQ section of the preamp. Now, when you're playing with these, you'll feel that they're really solid, like they're gonna last a long time. They got a good feel to them. Also, when you push them in, there's a little LED indicator as part of the button to let you know that it's also enabled. Before you get to the gain stage, before the preamp, is the actual EQ section. Now, this is where things can vary a lot between the different original Neves and between the original Neves and the clones. This model, the BAE 1028, it has a lot more EQ points than you would find on the original 1073 or even the 1084 Neve. That first pair of knobs, that's for the pass filter. So the outer knob is for the high pass filter, pass through the highs, get rid of the lows. The inner knob is the low pass filter, keep the lows, get rid of the highs. Both of these work on an 18 decibel per octave slope, which is pretty steep, and you cannot control that slope. What you can control is the frequency point at which that slope is occurring. Now, both of these knobs are stepped, okay? So that means you don't have free reign of where the EQ point is falling. There's certain fixed positions where you can set it to be. For the high pass filter, your options are 45, 70, 160, and 360 hertz. For the low pass filter, since this is getting rid of the high frequencies, these are all in kilohertz. So you've got 6, 8, 10, 14, and 18 kilohertz as your options. Now, I find that these two knobs are actually a little tough to move. They feel very tight. They're definitely solid feeling, but they're a little hard to move. That's as opposed to the other EQ knobs on this unit, which I feel move much better. Now, those other EQ sections that I mentioned, those are for low shelving, a high shelving, and a mid-band, like kind of bell style EQ. All three of those outer knobs are for selecting the frequency points. Again, these are stepped controls. The inner knobs are for controlling the amount of gain. And in this case, it's sweepable, all right? So you can do any which way you want on the inner knob, but the outer knob is stepped. That mid-band EQ, it also has a high Q section, which when engaged, the bell becomes much steeper. And in turn, it also changes how much gain you can get out of it. One little thing that's to note, even though the buttons seem similar, it feels the same as, say, the DI or EQ button earlier. For some reason, this one does not have an LED indicator like the others did. The low shelving, its frequency points are 35, 60, 110, and 220 hertz. And you can get plus or minus 16 decibels out of that. Now, there's a couple of quirks here. First of all, where is zero? Where is unity gain on this? Well, it's roughly straight down like the 6 o'clock position, but that's not quite perfect. You'll notice that if you turn the knob all the way clockwise or all the way counterclockwise, how far up it goes is not even on either side. For the high shelving control, it's got all the same kind of characteristics and quirks as the low shelving control. Your frequency points here are all in kilohertz, 10, 12, 16, 20, and 24 kilohertz. Now you might be thinking, 24 kilohertz? Why do we even need to go up that high? Well, because it's not so simple what happens when you boost frequencies, because boosting one frequency can cause adjacent frequencies to change as well. So yeah, sometimes boosting up that high can cause effects, certain strange effects on the music, sometimes pleasant ones. And also note that because of having the low pass filter option as well, you can do certain things where you play off the high shelving and the low pass against each other. Now the midband, it acts even stranger than the shelving. It's plus or minus 12 decibels instead of 16, except when you engage the high Q. As I mentioned, it changes the gain. So when the high Q is enabled, it's plus or minus 18. When it's off, it's plus or minus 12. Each dot is about 0.83 decibel when the high Q is out, and it's about 1.25 decibel when the high Q is in. The zero mark, the unity gain for, is in a different spot. Whereas the shelving, you had to point them straight down to 6 o'clock. On the midband, you need to point it to the left to 9 o'clock. And just like the shelving where it's not perfectly 6 o'clock, on the midband, it's not perfectly 9 o'clock either. And as you kind of turn it counterclockwise and clockwise, you'll see that it doesn't get as close to 3 o'clock in either direction. One positive here, though, is that midband has a lot of frequency points on this unit. 160, 270, 360, 510, and 700 hertz. And then in the kilohertz range, you've got 1.6, 3.2, 4.8, 7.2, 8.2, and 10 kilohertz. Next up, we are finally at the gain stage. We've got the preamp knob. It's stepped as well, so there's only fixed positions that it can be at. And bottom right-ish, and I don't know what that would be like maybe 5 o'clock or 4:30, is almost like an off or a bypass mode. So if you're on the mic in and it's in that mode, no sound will go through. It's not like it just kind of lets it go through without applying any gain. No, it blocks the sound from moving. So if you're using the mic in, you need to go one click clockwise from there. And if you're using the liken, go one click counterclockwise from there. Another strange quirk is how the labeling works here, and it's almost counterintuitive. On the liken side, you'll see that it goes from +10 to -20, and on the mic side, it goes from -20 to -80. Applying -80 decibels, does that make sense? Well, really, you have to think of it as like, what's the input level at, okay? So as you go from -20 to -80, you're applying more gain, not less gain, okay? So is your input coming in at like -20? Set it to the -20 level. If your input's coming in at -80, then set it to the -80 level. That's how that's set up. Moving on, you'll see a little tiny switch for impedance. Your default of 1200 ohms or 300 ohms if you are using an old mic or you want to experiment. The impedance switches, this is something I always find is like a really cool thing that in practice, I actually never really use. Finally, you've got an output knob. This is almost like a trim. So if you go fully clockwise on this unit, that is unity gain. And then as you back it off, it reduces the volume on you. Now, my understanding is that you're supposed to use this unit a lot like the API preamps, which is you want to run it hot. So what you really want to do is start off with that output knob fully clockwise, and then attenuate after this unit. In my case, I have my interface has a pad on it, a 20 decibel attenuator. So I'm going to turn that on, keep the output knob all the way up if I can, and then adjust the gain stage as needed. This should allow me to run out of the preamp up to 20 decibels above 0, but in practice, it'll probably be closer to maybe plus 14 decibels. Now you can actually get more juice out of this unit if you want. It will go up to 28 decibels above 0 before the rack unit clips. If you want to get up that high, probably in practice, you may be running into a high-end compressor anyhow, and that compressor might be able to help you attenuate even more than a normal pad on your interface. One other interesting thing is that you can actually play the gain knob and the output knob, you can play them against each other. So one thing that you could do is you could just like really start to crank the gain, add a lot more, and then pull back the output. And effectively, it's almost like you're overloading or saturating the gain stage before it gets to the output. And this should actually cause almost like a compression effect within this unit without having to use an outboard compressor. Okay, so that was a lot to get through, but let's finally hear this thing in action. We're gonna sample this on my bass drum, on my DW Collector's Purple Core Maple Kick. It's an 18x22. I'm using a BAE dynamic microphone outside the head. This is an Opus 99. I'm gonna play a series of different things, and we're gonna have seven different versions of this so you can hear how the sound kind of progresses as we work in the EQ. So we'll start off with the EQ section off. That will be our first sample. Then I'll turn on the EQ section, but everything will be flat. Then we'll add low shelving at 110 hertz, about 4 decibels. The fourth thing will be adding high shelving. This will be at 10 kilohertz. Again, is roughly 4 decibels we're adding. The fifth thing is going to be a mid cut at 1.6 kilohertz. It's going to be roughly 3 decibels cut, and the high Q section is off. Sixth, we're going to add a low pass filter. Remember, that gets rid of the high frequencies. We're going to add a low pass filter at 14 kilohertz. And for our seventh and final thing, I'm going to add a high pass filter at 45 hertz. I may end up regretting using that one, but we'll see. Now, some of this you'll hear in isolation. Some of it you'll hear as a full mix. When I'm doing the full mix, I'm adding for overheads, Earthworks TC30s. That's going through an A design specific preamp. I'm also using a sub-frequency, sub-kick mic in front of my bass drum in that case. Now in the DAW, my main BAE bass drum tracks are not going to have any additional processing. There won't even be any gating on that, but my other tracks will have additional processing. So what did you guys think? Do you think that this EQ was able to help kind of mold and shape the bass drum into some better starting sound going into the computer? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And of course, I have more stuff coming out all the time. Not just stuff on recording tips for drums and gear selection for that, but also cymbal reviews and stick reviews and lessons and the whole gambit of drum related stuff. So if you don't want to miss out, then don't forget to subscribe. Until next time, peace.